Bia, okay. This is Bia, and she's going to introduce Kat.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's great to see you all here. So my name is Beatriz, but I go by my nickname Bia Labache, and I am a Brazilian anthropologist. I live in Mexico. I'm moving to the Bay Area, and I'm a long-time friend of Kat and her fan, above all. And I was asked to introduce her, which I find a little bit challenging because she's like a library herself. She has a library, but I would say she's a library. So Kat is somebody that I go to ask references when I need. Kat is a big reference for a lot of us. I think she's a kind of pioneer, founding figure, and as such, it's hard to summarize a CV. But in any case, let's try it. She's an ethnobotanist. She has over 4 decades of empirical field work in Mexico, Peru, Ecuador, Costa Rica, and elsewhere, probably Hawaii. She has devoted her life to studying the relationship between man and the human species and nature, more particularly plants and mushrooms. She has a long history of experience with mushrooms, I believe in different levels, including some anecdotes that I hope she can tell us. And she's the head of Botanical Dimensions, that is an NGO that was founded in 1985 with her former partner, Terence McKenna. And Botanical Dimensions has been active for more than 3 decades, and they are currently located in Northern California. And they have an ethnobotanical library, and they offer courses and also a space of community encounters. And you're welcome to sign our sheets there if you want to receive the newsletter and also get to know more about Kat's course. So in sum, I just want to say that, I was born in 1971, and in 1976, when I was 5, Kat was heading to Peru to drink ayahuasca, which is what I study now. So in a time, before you could Google ayahuasca in Google, actually in a time before Google existed. So I have a great respect for Kat. Please, a big round of applause. Welcome, Kat.
Well, good evening, and thank you. I'm chuckling because Bia is quite a renowned intellectual and organizer of big conferences herself, and so for her to be called my assistant is a joke we'll have for a while. I'm honored to have her introduce me. And thank you all for being here. Thank you to this place, to Omni Commons, which I never had known about before. I love the idea that even the phrase, a collective of collectives, is very ecological, sort of, isn't it? It's how the natural world works. And thank you to BAM, Bay Area Applied Mycology, some old friends in that and some new ones. And it's such a good idea and a good cause. And I have to say, a team of 4 very eccentric fellows visited me up in Sonoma County when they invited me to come and speak here and brought lots of straw and mycelium and put all these wonderful edible species into my garden. So that was a unique invitation to speak, and I really appreciate it. Okay, let's see. I have done field work, which is sort of the professional term for working in other cultures, working in other areas of nature, going out into the field and studying, learning, observing, collecting. I've done that for decades with the Mazatec people, but I'm really here to talk more about what I've learned in my long friendship with a particular clan. So that's why I call this mushrooms, shamanism, and lore among the indigenous Mazatecs of Mexico, a glimpse of another worldview. It's just a glimpse, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. But I hope that I can respectfully convey some of the ways that I have glimpsed through their eyes, through their sharing with me, how they see the world, how they have seen the world in the past, and how they see the world in this moment of change. So that's really my goal, and there's a lot of mushroom technical, well, not too technical, but mycological information and cultural information. But I want to remember in this hour to stick with the deep lessons, the worldview, another way of seeing and being in the world that I think overall is a kind of medicine for us and for anyone who can listen to it. So that's my main goal in what I'm sharing with you tonight. Whoop. This worked when we practiced it. It's not working now. Can somebody help me with this? Maybe take out that little, but only somebody who really knows. And then put that back in again, please. Thank you. It's not working. Pardon? You don't know? I guess so. Darn it. If somebody, okay, I'll say next slide. Can somebody see if you can get this working so that I don't have to do that the whole time? It was working a little while ago. Okay. Next slide. Yes. Next slide. No. Okay. Oh, careful. Don't. This is the comic part of it. This is the pretend we're not really doing this in front of all of you. So what we're talking about, just to place you, thank you, is we're talking about the Sierra Mazateca, which is a region of southern Mexico that's part of the state of Oaxaca. Most of it's in the state of Oaxaca, which is a very large state you've probably heard of, a very a great number of indigenous people of many different languages that still exist. The languages are still alive, live in the state of Oaxaca. Mexico has the most ethnicities, indigenous ethnicities of any Latin American country, as far as I know, at this point. And there are 18 active and distinct languages being spoken in the state of Oaxaca. Mazatec is one of them, and the people of the Sierra Mazateca live up in the northeast corner of the state of Oaxaca, where the moisture comes in off the Gulf of Mexico. If you know Veracruz or Puebla, these big states, there, it's right where those all come together. We're going to be talking about... No, it's not working. Next slide. Okay, there, thank you. So the countryside looks like this these days. I'll just keep talking. I'm going to let the tech people do what they do, okay? Which arrow? Which arrow?
The right and left arrow.
It's not on there. We may start over. Let's see. So I want to say that the land that you glimpsed there is very wooded. It's second growth or third or 25th growth. The Mazatec people, they figure the people of this ethnicity and language have been in that region for at least 1,500 years. And it's very mountainous. It's very rumpled and remote. Yes, good. That works. Thank you, everybody. And people are, when I started going there in 1995, the people that I knew out in the hills like this, right there, were subsistence farmers. There was a dirt road that came down from the main town, Huautla, and there were many trails off of that, a network of trails all over these mountains. But everybody traveled by foot, basically. There were some donkeys, but not too many. And mostly it's so rugged, it's so steep and rocky that trails and roads didn't do so well. So this is a walking people. These are people who have songs about the clip-clop of their own feet, the sound of their own feet on the ground, on the rocks, as they walk up and down over every inch of these hills and valleys. The higher areas are temperate, the lower areas are tropical, so you're always going in and out of different climate zones and different temperature zones, ecotones, and so there are pine trees on the higher parts of these hills, and there are bananas and all sorts of tropical food just a little ways below, and there are all the different mushrooms that can grow in this very diverse habitat. And so we'll look at some of those. Again, the overview that I mentioned is that I want to ground this in the traditional ceremonial Mazatec practices and understanding of what these mushrooms are and how to relate to them, and then a little bit pointing toward the evolution that has happened as those moved into the subculture, the counterculture as we called it, in the mid-'70s, right here in the Bay Area. That's really where the whole psilocybin thing got rolling in the West, and that's because some notorious and nefarious characters, one of whom I was married to, figured out how to grow psilocybe cubensis. And as some of you were probably part of that same effort, if there are a few of you who are as old as I am, and there were many attempts to grow other psilocybe species too, but those weren't so productive or cooperative. So cubensis became it, and that sort of like moved us into a new era after the LSD era and before everything else started rolling in that was psychedelic. And then, as you know, because I think everyone's heard about it, there has been this trend in the last decade to finally get some research going, some scientific research, and so there are all these studies happening in universities in the West, in the United States, and in Canada, and in Europe, and Australia, and there are questions that go with that. It's a wonderful development, but it's also got a lot of questions. So I like questions. I'll leave you with more questions than answers, but that's my goal, is provoke thought, provoke questions. One big question is about worldview. And so the nutshell version of what a worldview is that it's the hidden substructure of what we understand to be real, what we understand to be true, the difference between good and bad, the difference between, say, luck and bad luck, the difference between, it's not just ethics, it's not just human behavior, it's actually fundamentally like what exists, what is real. The question, what is real, is different. The answer is different in different cultures, and so that's part of your worldview. And you're born with your worldview. It's already being fed to you before you emerge, and then language really, really codifies it. And so we grow up with this sort of way of understanding the world. You may be in a branch of it. You may have had hippie parents. You may have had come from another continent, and you've got influences of that. But overall, the Western American, materially based, accomplishment based recognition of what matters is our worldview. And if you're in this room and talking about mushrooms and interested in just the fungi in general, but psychedelics as well, then you probably already have some open spaces in your worldview where you're questioning, you know. So one thing that I think this introduction of psilocybin from this culture that we're going to describe, the way that has come into our more buttoned down worldview is that it has helped not only open it up, not only question authority, of course, and question, kind of a consensus reality, but also to see the animated nature of the world, that mushrooms are so animated. All of us who love any kind of mushrooms, who love just to find them in the woods or grow them in our gardens, we know that they all seem to have like a sense of humor, don't they? And they have definitely a sense of the bizarre, but also they have all of these amazing powers and metabolisms and relationships and all of that. So as a model for a worldview, many of us adapted the idea of mycelium and mycelial networks and the internet being compared to that, but also just human relations being compared to that. So these questions that I have here, can a worldview be changed? What influences that change? Can a species that we ingest or that we take into our care actually affect our worldview? And what comes from that when that shifts? How do our values shift? How do we take care of the world if we see it differently, if we come to see it differently in our lifetime? How does that change our sense of what stewardship is, of what our job is here? So those kind of underlie this because these people have a sense, that the people I work with have a sense of a responsibility to life, to living things, to each other, but also to those that they don't know far away. And I want to give a caveat here. I am not representing the Mazatec worldview, and I don't know that there is a single one, but there are definitely some themes that run through the lives and beliefs and rituals and songs and practices of Mazatec people. I have not worked with all of them. I've only worked with a few of them, a few different like familial threads, but I settled in one clan. So my 23 years of work has been with one clan with a elder healer patriarch at the top, and then 4 generations of mostly women and children and some men who appear and disappear that descend from him. And so I'm speaking for the teachings I've received from this clan, influenced a bit by some curanderas or women healers that I worked with 20-some years ago, and then a lot of reading and personal experiences with these mushrooms and with using the practices that they've taught me. So I'm not representing everyone. Don't take it as like what a whole people does. But this is the town of Huautla de Jimenez, which is quite renowned up in the mountains of the Sierra Mazateca. It's the business hub and population hub of the Mazatec people, but they are scattered all over those mountains that I showed you. And when tourists, whether they're from Mexico City or from other countries, come to Mexico in search of a mushroom experience, they generally go up to Huautla, which is a quirky town. Some people find it charming and some don't. But the Mazatecs have been a very private people for a very long time. I mean, they moved into those mountains a millennia and a half ago for some reason, and it's considered probably an outgrowth of the whole Olmecan collapse far before that. But this group moved up to where they were isolated, could live in tiny villages, but more often than that, just scattered single or double homes out in these canyons and on these mesas, and they didn't want to be interacting with the world. When the Aztecs came, they did their best to get them out of there, and that was right before the Spanish arrived. The Spanish just found them very hard to deal with, kind of dispersed into the woods and didn't have a lot of riches, and so the Spanish left them quite alone for a long time, although Catholicism got started. And Huautla was the hub of that outreach of these outsiders into Mazatec culture. But you could only get to Huautla by donkey until I think until the early 60s, and the first road came in, and then still it was like a dangerous and tortuous ride up. So it's been remote until recently, and Huautla is the point of opening to the world. And to those that I know, that I work with, who live way out in the boondocks, they feel that Huautla is a dangerous place because of that opening, and because they feel that their fellow Mazatecs don't necessarily have enough skills at self-protection to be able to deal with all the interface of the world. Part of the work of shamans and healers is to protect, and it is to put up a shield, a soft shield around the people and the places they care for, and have that be permeable, but permeable with great discernment. And so large urban or even small urban centers, there are so many people you don't know. There's so many vibes. Basically, this is a vibration-based culture, because it's a magical culture. There's always something invisible that's going on. And if you aren't trained and tuned to know what that is, then you're vulnerable to attachment by these invisible forces. That's part of their worldview. So the people I know don't want to live in a town. They want to live out in the boondocks, because that's where they can do their work, this magical work, this work that affects the whole world. And like other healers that I've met in other places in the Amazon as well, some of them say, the time has come. We know that a great deal is going on out there in the world, and there's so much suffering, and we have work to do, and we don't have to go there. We just have to pray really hard, or we have to do ceremony a lot, or we have to invoke the help of the plants and the spirits all the time. And for those who come and go, we have to give them the strength and the clarity and the gifts that they need to be able to go out there in the world and do good work and come and go from that. So that's kind of like an overview of how I've encountered Indigenous people working with healing. They're actually not sharing everything with me by any means, and I'm not asking them to, but they are intentionally sharing some things that they feel are important to put out in the world for the sake of the world at large, for the sake of everybody else that they'll never meet, which I just find to be really touchingly generous of them. Subsistence farmers means people who grow everything or gather and forage everything that they eat and use, and that's how they were when I first got there. They are still to a large degree. Some of the branches of the family still are entirely. So everybody grows maize or corn, though, and in fact, the Tehuacan Valley near here is where maize was first domesticated 12,000 years ago. So it's very close to the hub of that, which spread all over the world. And they're multi-generational, living in close proximity to each other, or they certainly were only 20-some years ago. This is a daughter of the old healer and his granddaughter. I met her when she was tiny, I think maybe here. This is the year I met them, and little Rosalba was 6, and she's still, our families are blended, and she's my godchild. She has children. My children have godchildren there. We have come and gone. I've brought a niece and a couple of dear friends and my daughter, and we all saw from the beginning, I saw, and Don Rutilio saw, that what he says that destiny actually lays out paths that can connect, that it's a set of points, like on a map. He actually drew a map of a kind of generic destiny of points. And he said, you don't necessarily cross something that is part of your destiny every day. You don't cross it every day. But you need to be tuned in enough so that when you do cross a line of your destiny, or you come to a crossroads of your destiny, that you will recognize it. And he and I recognized something when we met. And he didn't explain it until just a few years ago, but that sense of that it's a combination of destiny, that there is a plan from above for what is potentially each of our paths, what might happen to each of us, what we might be offered, and then that it's up to us, to our intelligence, to our ability to pay attention, to our respect for this practice, to notice when that is. And the mushrooms are one of the main tools, main allies for showing us what our path is, what the next stretch of the path is, to the next point where destiny will again give us a choice. That psilocybin mushrooms are here to reveal to us our paths, and then it's up to us to take them, to remember to stay on them, to make them individual in a way. It's not like it will tell you exactly what to do. It just will give you opportunities and the insight to know when to take something very seriously. So this little family, these very poor people, come out of a long tradition. There were healers in his family way back. He was recognized when he was a boy for having certain intuitive skills, and then was trained from the age of 11 by his uncle, who lived more remotely than the rest of them, and trained by, oh, thank you very much. That's way better for me. Trained to it's hot up here. He says, when I asked him just again a few years ago, why did you start this? I had already heard the story from his family, because these people don't speak, the couple, Don Rutilio and his wife, Maria Luisa, do not speak Spanish. I speak Spanish. They do not speak Spanish. They only speak Mazatec. So people living in remote mountains, 500 years, under the Spanish rule and the Spanish language, who never took on the language of the conquerors, not only kept their language intact, not only kept their knowledge of the biodiversity of their region intact, they kept their stories and their songs and their practices, and they kept their secret mushroom religion, as it's called, intact as well. They basically have been in the underground for 500 years. And you all know what the underground is, right? I mean, culturally, what the underground is. It's a place where we hide things that we feel the light of day would endanger them or endanger us, maybe because they're illegal, maybe because they're secret, maybe because they're precious, a combination of all of those. And definitely this mushroom ceremonial practice was illegal in terms of the Spanish Catholicism that came in, but many, many people in these mountains never let the colonizers' language take them over. And so they had their own names for things. They did adopt saints. They did adopt some other things that come from that. But I just find that role as knowledge holders over 500 years before the world shined a light on it, which only happened in the 1950s, is a remarkable thing, to know that you're, through that many generations, to know that you're holding secret knowledge that you have to protect, and you have to nourish it, you have to keep it alive, you have to tell stories about it, and you have to keep your offspring knowing which mushrooms are which, and how to talk to them and who they are, because there's many different species that are psilocybin containing, and it's all tied together with knowing the land, knowing the history of the land, knowing the species on the land, knowing something about why this very obscure spiritual methodology is so precious that generations should be devoted to protecting it and keeping it alive. And they've done that, but now we're in the time of change. So among the things they grow, I mentioned maize or corn. That's their staple, and beans, of course, and a lot of foraged wild foods. And they plant for protection. They plant intentionally. The Brugmansia here would be both beauty and protection. They taught me that beauty can be protection, which is something that I've really appreciated knowing all these years. They live on the edge of the wild. They live, tucked into wildness. And so the whole concept of the balance of the tame and the wild, and how that's exhibited in their lives, and how the power of the wild comes through what they cultivate and what is tame and what they let in, and which wild things to let into their lives, into their bodies, into their marketplaces. These are all important things. But they're also mushroom people. They're mycophiles, and that means they love all the mushrooms. And this, I believe, you can confirm here is maitake. Does that look right? Yeah, and they're very proud of it, obviously. This is just a couple, very poor couple, who walked miles in from the wooded home to the village with this one mushroom find to walk around in the market and sell it to someone who is willing to pay for such a delicious treat. And in the marketplace, you might find, and it's just open mercado, you might find schizophilum. Does anybody here eat those? I mean, they're universal, but does anyone know of them being edible? They're. I can't hear you, but anyway, I didn't know that. They're picked very fresh and obviously cherished and cooked up regularly. They also have some very strange ritual foods like this beautiful orchid, Stanhopeia oculata. Oculata means the eyes that are on those dark spots that are on it. And the bulb of this orchid is ground at a certain day each year and mixed with tortillas for a particular ritual feast. So in case you've never tried orchid bulbs, there's another food category. And then they know many things about plants as well. The Mazatec people are recognized. Like in 95 when I first went down there, I went to a Zapotec person that I knew, and I'd been to that region before, another part of Oaxaca several times before. And I said, I have a health problem. I have been to doctors about it, but before I do anything more committed to the medical system, I want to go follow my own. I'd already been doing field work with ayahuasca, and I'd been in the psychedelic scene in California and for 20 years or 30 years, I guess. And I said, so I want to go to a healer who knows how to work with mushrooms and see if I can heal myself. And I said, should I go to a Zapotec person, a Mixtec person, a Mihe? These are all people around that region. And he said, no, you have to go to the Mazatecs. They're the ones who know the plants and the mushrooms the best in that way. And, urged me to go up there. And then another friend, anthropologist Brett Blosser, he actually led me to this very remote family. I mean, he gave me instructions on how to find them and a recommendation, something to tell them so they would know that I was indeed safe, because he had gone, the Mazatec area is just riddled with huge cave systems. It's got its own underworld, caves everywhere, miles long, 6-mile long caves, filled with rivers and all sorts of things, amazing. Some of them with old icons, and obviously ancient practices happened in these caves. And anyway, he had been spelunking, cave exploring, and encountered these people way out in the boondocks and gotten to know them some years before. So he was my introduction to them. But they also know a lot about plants, and they each healer, and this is pretty much true wherever you go to indigenous healers in the world, that there may be, say there's like 8 or 10 prized shamanic species in that region, but not everyone is going to use all of those. People apprentice with a species. They study with that species for a long time in order to have it be part of their medicine kit, something they understand, that understands them, that they can work with. And so if a healer in training develops one relationship over months or even years with one species of plant or mushroom, and then another one, and then maybe a third, if you've got 3 different species that you can do this kind of work with, then you're a trained healer. Then you can offer to help people. You've got to have, the various techniques, and then you've got to have a lot of miles on you already. But you don't necessarily have to have an in-depth relationship to every powerful species in your region. That's how they see it, and I've seen that in other places. So, for instance, the people I work with, they don't use as a regular practice. They don't use the morning glory seeds, but other people just nearby do regularly. And the morning glory seeds of this species and another species as well, Ipomea violacea, they help people to find lost things, to see people who are far away. With people, Mazatec people don't tend to come to El Otro Lado, the other side, which is the United States, but everybody knows some people who've gone to the other side. And so a common thing all over Mexico is to go to a ceremony and take something or be invoked into a trance where you can find your lost person on the other side, your person in the United States that you haven't heard from for a few years, or you wonder if they're dead or alive. And then they can see, oh, they're alive. Okay, they're working. Oh, they're in a big city. Oh, they're out in hot fields. Oh, they're not alive anymore. You know, they can see that in these ceremonies. So that's part of why what is done in that way. Lost people is a motif that you hear in mythology all over the world. The Rip Van Winkle idea, too. Someone who goes and falls asleep and is sort of taken underground by the little people and doesn't come back out for a decade. That's a meme that you hear in folklore everywhere, including up in these mountains. And one of the healers or shamans' jobs is to find those people. Here's the other morning glory. And then, of course, the mushrooms. And there are a number of psilocybe species that these folks use because so many grow there. This is psilocybe cerulescens, which is called derrumbes, which means upheaval or the landslide or the avalanche at the side of the road. And they tend to grow in disturbed earth. Each of these species of psilocybe mushrooms has its own persona. That's how it's seen. We know that they each have, they're genetically distinct. They're actually species named with Latin names by scientists. And they also each have a different array of a few different chemicals, alkaloids. So no two species have the same proportions of alkaloids, which then, in the reductionist sense, gives them each a different kind of dose of central nervous system activating experiences that a human or a mammal of any sort is going to get from eating them. But you're not necessarily going to get the same ratio or the same experience from each different species. So a person in the Mazatec scene might apprentice to 2 or 3 different psilocybe species over their 5 or 10 years of training. And because each of them is a different person, it's like calling on a different friend to come help you with a certain task. Ooh, I've got to, dig a new garden. I'll call up that friend. They'd be good to help me. Oh, I'm going to build a house, and I want it to be well built and safe and not... I don't want to offend anyone while I'm doing it because I don't want bad luck to be built into the house. So I'll call on this person who knows how to conscientiously do things in that way. Or, I've fallen in love with this woman, but I don't know if it's a good thing that I should ask for her hand in marriage. So I'll call on that mushroom to advise me like you would call on your best friend to advise you. So people train under a certain mushroom, and then they have the skills and the powers that go with that particular species. This is from that old marvelous Golden Guide to Hallucinogenic Plants that was published for 1 minute in the 1970s before somebody seized control of Golden Press again and got rid of it. But anyway, those of us who know love it. And these were many psilocybe species that Dr. Richard Schultes, the premier ethnobotanist, who should read about if you don't know who he was, Dr. Schultes, and his marvelous life of work. He influenced many of us in the field greatly. And he did his dissertation work in these mountains with the Mazatecs and the Chinantec people back in the 1930s. He got his PhD research done there. And so he documented a lot of these things. He didn't actually ever see a ceremony, but he documented a lot of the species there. And he was the one of the authors of this little golden guide. So all of these species were somewhere in the Mazatec region. With climate change, just as you've seen here, a lot of mushroom populations are really changing. Some seem to have disappeared. Others seem to have periodically be booming, but at a time out of sync with when they were before. The mushroom season in Mazatec country, when it's at the peak because of the rains, has generally been like late May through July or into August. And so that was the only time when they really had them for all the work that they have to do, for how important they are to maintaining their world, holding it together, keeping everybody healthy and fed and not killing each other, and all of the different things that you have to do when you're sort of keeping the cosmic peace in an area, you know. Keeping the animals fed, keeping the animals coming, keeping the plants growing. You're like negotiating with all of these forces of the world to nourish them, to thank them, to notice them, to name them, to sing songs about them. It's how you keep the world alive, is to notice it, talk to it, engage with it, walk out in the hills and look at it, learn the names of it, teach them to somebody else. That's the relationship of reciprocity with the natural world that keeps the natural world nourishing us. And this invisible reality, invisible except when you've taken psilocybin mushrooms, this invisible reality which is always at work, which is very busy and always humming. And so you know all the time you should be engaging with awareness of that world, even though you're not necessarily in a ceremony and seeing it. That's a worldview that is very active, that's just like a sphere in which there isn't any dead space. Everything is interactive, everything is alive, everything requires a kind of attention, and that's really our job, but it's also the most nourishing way to be. That's what they tell me. So it's your job, and the job nourishes you too. There's a long history in a much larger region of southern Mexico and Central America in some kind of mushroom, ceremonial, established mushroom religion, for lack of a better word. I hesitate every time I say that. But it's a codified spiritual belief system that has apparently existed over at least several thousand years in Central America. And one way we know, there's not a lot of evidence, but one way we know is that about 200 of these kind of mushroom stones have been found in different areas of ruins in southern Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, that region. And I was imagining one before it was found, its life in the jungle there with that illustration. And so that implies this long history in a much larger area than the Mazatecs covered. But so many changes have happened, and as you all know, the Maya, went from a huge empire and died back for mysterious reasons. There are lots of theories, and the Aztecs were only the very last kind of gasp of the great monumental Mesoamerican cultures right before the Spanish came, but there were many before that, and they've come and gone for a number of different reasons, which include climate change, waves of climate change that have come before, not human-caused climate change at that time, but so we don't know what people were practicing with the mushrooms or which species it was that generated this art, but we know that there's a deep history and a respect for it, even among people who don't practice it anymore, among indigenous people who just know about it and don't practice it. The Spanish Inquisition, I'll just say quickly, was timed both in Spain and Europe, where it was fiercely clamping down on herbalists and healers of all sorts, and anyone who practiced kind of wild native medicine or or prayer or healing was, obliterated or tortured in different ways in Europe. But that's just after the Spanish got to the Americas, and so you see the Spanish Inquisition as it was expressed in the New World as well. And I don't think people really think about that. Nobody likes to think about the Inquisition, but it's good to have cautionary tales of what happens when authority gets too strong and really uptight and comes down on people and goes village to village and imprisons 20% of the population. I mean, right? It happens even in sophisticated societies. We like to think ours is sophisticated. So it's good to look at this concept of what can happen, of this history of what can happen, and remember that and be aware of that. And in this case, when this came in, these people said, we've got something so precious, we're just going to sink into the woodwork and hide it and keep it alive. And we're grateful to them for doing that. These are some of these are adults, but some of the children, just to see that ethnobotany, ethnomycology, ethno means people, ethno means culture. And so always it's the relationship with the people, real people who are doing these things now, people who know these things now, that is part of the work and of the field work. When you're studying a plant-human relationship or a mushroom-human relationship, then you need to have your own relationships with the humans, because they're the mediators to the plants and to the mushrooms, and because they're also just precious. They're just precious. They're like, gosh, they're so deeply rooted in a kind of aliveness that I think our culture just longs for, and I just feel so fortunate to have spent so much time over the years with people who will stop in a moment if they feel something is strange, or if they feel sudden gratitude, and just express that in that place. And it might be by silently doing a small act, a small offering. It might be by singing a song. It might be by stamping their feet and whisking a trail away so it becomes safe for other people to pass on it. But they're dealing with magical entities. They're dealing with spirits of the land. They're dealing with ghosts, people who didn't pass on in a happy way. They're dealing with the spirits of the plants and the animals that live there. Many of them are beneficent, but some of them are not. But most of all, what is not is being disrespectful to what's there. Disrespect, a human's disrespect to the power of the species, the beings, and the diversity around them. Disrespect is what generates illness. It's what generates violence against you or your family. It's what generates runs of bad luck. And luck and bad luck are huge concepts in these indigenous cultures, because it's how people explain patterns of things that happen to us. And they don't feel that they're condemned to bad luck. They feel that can happen and a pattern can develop, but the human's role then is to go to your allies. In this case, it would be psilocybin mushrooms. Do whatever form of ceremony works for you for communicating with them, through them, and work on that trend that's happening in your life until it gets back to a place of balance. Balance is health. Imbalance is misfortune and patterns of loss and patterns of painful things happening. And so to restore that balance where your seeds germinate, your food grows, your children are born healthy, your man stays with you, your woman is tolerant, whatever your various challenges are, it takes this constant tending. And they call it prayer. There are other words in Mazatec, and I don't speak Mazatec, and it is a marvelous, complex language. But the bilingual Mazatecs call it prayer, that they're not praying to the mushroom, they're praying through the mushroom, basically. That the mushroom, and when I say that, I mean whichever species they're using, is really giving them access to places beyond, to beings beyond, to an intelligence that is whole. When I asked Don Rutilio just a few years ago some really big abstract questions about what makes things happen the way they happen, and, you know, like fate, and just like giant questions that are hard to understand if we spoke the same language, not to mention we were speaking 3 languages, going through a granddaughter who was interpreting. Gosh, I just lost my train of thought. Well, I asked him these big questions, and he said, "Oh, I know." And he said, "I said, you know, do you address God?" And I already knew from being in ceremonies that they didn't directly, but I asked him, and he said, "No. God is everything. Everything is God, all of it, and you can't address all of it." And anyway, it's just like not there, not within reach, but there are many, many emissaries. And the little mushroom, los honguitos, los niños santos, the holy children, they call them, they open the door so we can talk to this one or that one, this sort of bigger intermediary helper on a large level. So it might be the Virgin of Guadalupe, who is beloved by people throughout Mexico and has become, you know, one of their main allies, and among the Mazatecs as well. But they also say, or certain scholars of the Mazatecs say, well, of course, there was already a compassionate mother goddess before, because every cosmology has one, and the Virgin of Guadalupe was what the Spanish said theirs was, or she appeared to the, it's a longer story, but to the Indians of the Mexico City region, and then was adopted after that brilliant sighting by many other native people. But there are other saints that each have different qualities that they've adopted, and they say, well, that matches up to the saint of the place or the plant or the qualities that we had before. And so it's syncretic. It's syncretic. It's a blend that has occurred over 500 years, but without losing this kind of core among this little group that I've worked with. I want to say that again. They leave offerings along trails and by springs and in places where there's clean water that you can drink, or where there's a particular tree that's rarely seen. They'll make a little shrine and leave offerings. Those are cacao beans that they're leaving as offerings there. Live very humbly. This is the way that most people were living when I first started going there. It's changed. This is much about change, and I'll show you toward the end some of what has changed. So just building out of cane and old tar paper and old metal that's cast off from tin can factories and that kind of thing. And the Virgin of Guadalupe I mentioned, there she is at a high point above Huautla de Jimenez. And you've probably all heard of Maria Sabina, who was the Mazatec curandera, or healer, who was discovered, so to speak, by R. Gordon Wasson, who was an amateur mycologist and his wife Valentina, who were exploring in that region in the 1950s, looking for sacred mushroom practices, and they encountered her, and she facilitated their exploring the psilocybes and did a ceremony, and that was the beginning of the opening to the West. That's when the bright spotlight of our voracious attention shot right down into the dark, safe underground place that this culture had been holding it for so long. And it's not been the same since. We've gone through many changes, and they're still occurring at a fast rate, and so have the Mazatecs. So this transition from secret knowledge held for many, many generations to exposed knowledge being used without training, and yet still having gifts in it, gifts and perils, and all of that. That transition is part of what I'm trying to illustrate for you. She suffered greatly in her life. she was hailed because of all the literature about her and all of the limelight as, the Mazatec shaman, which is marvelous that we, in the West, we didn't know what shamanism was. We didn't have that word in common language yet in the 1950s. So we learned what a shaman is. We learned what shamanism was, a little tiny bit about it. But to have suddenly this exalted new archetypal character that we never knew existed, because it didn't exist in our culture, our mixed, largely Euro-descended culture, to have that exalted persona be represented by a tiny, poverty-stricken indigenous woman meant we just infiltrated, the archetypes quite quickly there. She did. She basically burnt out because of that. And many other people that I know, they're always refer to her as pobrecita, poor little Maria. She just didn't know what she was getting into, and it just ate her up. But that transition happened. The world was sporulated at that moment. It all shot out there into us. And so now it's in our hands. She's a big part of the popular and rather often tacky identity of the Mazatec people that you see in Huautla only. So I'm telling you this because if you happen to go there, who here has ever been there? So maybe a dozen of you. Yeah, so it's a mixed bag. Wonderful people everywhere you go, and but it's tricky once you've made something a commodity, basically. And she basically was commodified, and so was the mushroom for a long time. And there was the huge, overwhelming so-called hippie invasion of the late 60s and the 70s when people had done LSD and then heard there were mushrooms and went down there and really kind of scandalized this town. And even when I started coming in the 90s, there were a lot of people who were just they just look away. They didn't want to talk. They just didn't want any kind of notice coming anymore. And I headed out into the sticks and worked on a one-to-one relationship with someone, so it was it went better for me. But you still feel that, and you also feel the attachment and the sense of pride that they were, for a moment, their 15 minutes of fame. They were this place that was discovered, but that's mostly by people who don't practice it anymore. So it's complicated. I'm not going to psychoanalyze Huautla, but if you've been there, I bet you've felt the shadows as well as the light there. I thought the mushrooms playing musical instruments, you might find that interesting since many of you are mushroom people. How many of you would call yourselves mushroom people? Can you raise your hands? Whatever that means. Great. Okay. Well, here you go. This isn't really the dark side. This is these are two knowledgeable old ladies doing business, and that's because one of them knows how to hunt mushrooms, and the other one is a midwife who does healing ceremonies sometimes. And those morning glory seeds I mentioned are used in midwifery too. They're given sometimes to a mother who's having a difficult time giving birth. It's coming very slowly, and the morning glory seeds have an LSD-like ergot compound in them, and they cause the uterus to contract and for the mother to relax into kind of a dreamy state. And between those two effects, the baby then comes more quickly. So it's not just used for finding people and things. It's used also for facilitating birth. And this woman knows that stuff, and she also does mushroom ceremonies. So she was buying a leaf-wrapped dose of mushrooms there to administer. You all, I'm sure, know the cubensis of the 70s and onward, and how, the gift to our culture of a mushroom you could grow, and how much we learned about growing mushrooms, all sorts of mushrooms, from that introduction of cubensis, because really it wasn't something that people practiced, growing mushrooms in their garden, knowing how to do petri dishes and mycelium and semi-sterile techniques and all that kind of stuff was not at all common knowledge. And we didn't have any mushroom in our grocery stores except for, the little button agaricus, and that were grown in, I was always told as a child, grown in caves in Pennsylvania. So I didn't know what that's my image for 20 years, was that Pennsylvania was filled with caves, filled with mushrooms. But I guess they were grown underground partly in Pennsylvania. Anyway, that was just our grocery store mushroom. We had no sophistication about fungi. We were mycophobic, basically. And then cubensis came along, and because so many of us had, schooled ourselves on LSD already, and we had a love and a joy of the psychedelic state, then we were just delighted to see a new species come along that was actually natural, that was actually, something that grew, and better than that, we could grow it ourselves. It wasn't distributed from a hub unknown to us far away. It was actually something we could have our own individual relationships with, and that was such a blessing. The Mazatecs call cubensis, it's one of their mushrooms there. Excuse me, they call cubensis San Isidro, named after San Isidro, Saint Isidore, who is the patron saint of laborers, of masons, of people who build roads, of people who do hard physical labor that takes methodical planning and work. And so it's not the favorite mushroom of Mazatec people that I know. The ones I know preferred the rumbes, which is Psilocybe cerulescens, or Psilocybe mexicana, which is called pajaritos, little birds. I think I'll show you a picture of that too. And so it's just so interesting to me, and I pointed it out many times before, that this mushroom that is considered the workhorse of the Mazatec pantheon is the one that came to us. And of all the ones that all those nerdy guys tried to grow back then, the only one that really offered itself to be readily grown was cubensis, and that's then the one that has been the theme of our mushroom-driven psychedelic renaissance, And so if you are an animist, as these people are, who believe that everything is alive and everything has a role and everything's communicating with everything else, you notice which species comes forward and offers itself. You notice when something falls in your lap. It's a signal. It's a message. You pay attention. This one fell in our lap. This is the one that then has fueled our interest and perhaps the interest of many of you. And that's just something to think about, because had it been another species that had offered itself for this homegrown revolution, then we might have a different flavor to our whole sense of mushrooms. But also, we didn't get the training. Nobody here had experienced the Mazatec ceremonies. We didn't have the sense that psychedelics could be done in a ceremonial way. The ayahuasca phenomenon hadn't happened yet, which brought in a lot of that kind of concept of how we, follow the rules of another culture or amend those rules, but know what those rules are, sort of, that there are instructions that go with the medicine. We didn't have the sense of there being any instructions. Our sense came from the initial psychedelic revolution of LSD, which is like anything goes, right? Anything goes. And so we were kind of in the anything goes mode as we entered our psilocybe relationship. But this idea of attributing agency, attributing intelligence and choice, and even maybe to some extent conscious influence coming from a species, plant or mushroom species, is typical of animism around the world, which means typical of all of your ancestors as well, because there hasn't been anybody in the long history of human beings who didn't believe that everything was alive and interconnected until we forgot. Until pretty recently, until the age of reason, so to speak, and until the Industrial Revolution and all of that. So it's not simply exotic and other for you, whichever culture your ancestors come from. It's part of your own ancestry, that way of seeing the world as animated. And that's I think that's a shift in worldview that I feel has happened in the last generation or two that is hopeful to me, given the craziness that is going on in so many ways, the desperate, disempowering of so many species, people, cultures, and all of those things. If we remember, that all of these are working together, this mycelial network, and how our job is to find our role in it and help take care of it. The tending the wild concept of the native Californians and of the native people of wildlands, that know the wild, tend it, maybe tame and manage some of it, always say thank you, continually revisit the review in your dreams, in your ceremonies, in your solo time, in your circles, in order to be a good member of this huge network of beings. That's really what I have continued to get from my Mazatec friends. We learned about life cycles. We learned about psilocybe species that exist in North America that didn't have any history of human use that we know of. But having psilocybes in our lives pointed us toward, what's around here? And they're still being discovered. I've learned just this year that psilocybe elenii was discovered growing in the Bay Area, and that wasn't known until, I don't know, maybe the last 5 years or something. At least I've only learned it recently. And azurescens from up in the Columbia River area, and these are all powerful medicines that each have their own, or powerful species, may or may not be medicines, that each have their own, ratios of alkaloids, and so they each have their own character. And not everyone is everyone's ally. That's another factor, is like each individual human may have, it's just like you're not friends with everyone. You do select your friends based on who feels good, who helps each other, who enjoys each other. And it's the same with the mushrooms too. These are the psilocybin, psilocin, baeocystin, phenethylamine. These are the different compounds that might be in any one of these psilocybe mushrooms. And here's a leaf full of the mexicanas, little tiny mushrooms that are already breaking down just the same day that they're harvested. These people say that the two things about where the mushrooms grow, because they're not cultivated, they can't be cultivated, they're just found growing in the wild. They say that that they grow where lightning has struck the land, that mushrooms will come up there, and that the power of the lightning and the insight of that flash of light is in the mushroom. And then that's what you're asking for when you go into ceremony with them. And if you find mushrooms, those mushrooms, that means tonight you're doing a ceremony. You don't have time to think about it. They don't traditionally dry anything. It's too damp there. There's no history of drying their mushrooms. And so during mushroom season, you find these mushrooms, you call a ceremony together, and you've usually got someone who's been waiting because they've got some dire situation. Somebody's very sick, some pattern of misfortune, the rains haven't come yet, and that all needs to be invoked, or just within one's family. Or it's not just problem solving, it's ceremonies for gratitude. And I have sat in the most beautiful ceremonies I've ever been in. No fancy clothes, no beautiful decorations, no fantastic musicians. All those things are in some ceremonies, in some places. But these are just people living on a dirt floor in a single room with a dusty table that's got a few found objects that are considered sacred and a couple of pictures of saints and a plate full of mushrooms. And it is the most beautiful prayer of gratitude for the richness of life that I've ever heard. And it goes on for hours and hours with just such moving and joyful testimonials, and also really witnessing suffering, just really crying together even, because you see the suffering around you, you see how this person or that person has just been pulled through the ringer, and the shedding tears for someone witnessing that is part of these ceremonies. And these ceremonies are very small. They may only be 3 people, 5 people, 6, a family. The children at your knee go to sleep during the ceremony. Everybody participates in the ceremony, in the ones I've experienced, whether or not they take the mushrooms. And most of the adults, if they come to the ceremony, they're going to take the mushrooms. And that means they're up for the night and they're in this state, and then there are the things like collective visions, which have been documented by outsiders too, not only myself, but I know another anthropologist who, he tells a wonderful story about, he was actually studying kind of like dark shamanism, the shadow and the ill-intentioned, shooting of illness into other people, that whole aspect of shamanism, which is just as alive as the good-hearted side. And he was studying that, and he wasn't really that into taking the mushrooms. He just wanted to hang out with the people who did that. But he spent a couple of years in Mazatec country, and and he told me way back when he was still doing field work that he'd been in a ceremony where he kept being distracted. Like it's like 4 or 5 of them. They're all sitting, staring at this rough altar for hours, and he kept being distracted by what appeared to be like gowns hanging down, like someone's gowns hanging down from the upper corner of the room. And he was like, it was like an angel or something, like something in all these draped fabrics, but I could only see the lower part of them. And then I actually saw their feet. And he just said it just stayed there for like 2 hours or something, And then at some point the ceremony wound down and he stepped outside to go look at the stars. And one of the Mazatec men inside stepped out with him, and the first thing he said to him was, "How about that angel that was hanging out up in the corner of the room the whole ceremony?" Yeah, it was just like a validation of having 2 people having seen the same thing for a long time, and that's certainly happened in some of the ceremonies I've been in as well. I have to mention tobacco because tobacco is the main gateway for prayer for the Mazatecs, as it is for people who use tobacco and who domesticated it from the wild all through the Americas. And can I have a time check, please? I don't have any time. It's 8:30? Oh, it is? Oh, my gosh. I'm sorry. Is it okay? Can I keep going a little bit? But you might want to do question and answer. Okay, I'll go. I'll just go for like 10. I'll go for 10 minutes, and then we'll have like 10 or 15 minutes of questions. Is that okay? Is that all right? Okay. But let's see. The Mazatec people traditionally don't smoke it. They do grow this species of Nicotiana tabacum, which originally was domesticated in the upper Amazon region and traded up, but we don't know how many, perhaps thousands of years ago, at least a very long time ago, traded up so that people all through Central America and through Mexico were growing it and using it ceremonially long before the Spanish got there. Some smoke it in some places. There are many different ways to use tobacco, but the Mazatecs don't. Most of all, they pray to it. They grind up the leaves of 2 different varieties, they put it in a mound on their altar, and they lean over and talk to it. And they call it San Pedro, San Pablo, which is St. Peter, St. Paul, 2 saints who they say are brothers, who protect the inner. St. Paul protects the inner, the heart and the hearth, and San Pedro protects the gate and the path and the outer world. So they're kind of a take on the role of the Catholic saints, and they talk to San Pedro, San Pablo like in a murmur, over and over, saying the names, and then saying very quietly what it is they're asking, who they're asking to speak to. It is beyond them. They say that San Pedro, San Pablo is the best communicator, the best carrier of messages in the world, but also the best protector. And in fact, Don Rutilio says that if he didn't have tobacco, he couldn't do any of the rest of the work because it wouldn't be safe for his family, for his patients. Because in order to make people vulnerable in a psychedelic state, you have to set up really good protection for them, and you have to maintain that invisible protection for them throughout, before, during, and after, and give them some blessing that they can carry it on with them. And that's what this presence of this tobacco intelligence does in a person, in a ceremony, in a family. So he will mark, and this is very typical of other people too, mark the points of the house, the maybe the edge of the garden, anywhere that's considered an entry point for the unknown, to protect the place, but also the person, and rub it on the person, and rub it, even make footprints to walk on of tobacco, so that as you walk away, you'll carry your protection with you. They do that for me before I leave. And then during the for prayer, late at night by himself, he will put a pinch of it in his, it's mixed with slaked limestone, so it has an alkaline element that allows it to be absorbed in the mouth, and he'll put a pinch of it into his cheek, and then he'll pray even harder. And so he invited me at some point to do that with him. He said he recognized, and this was a great compliment when he finally said this about 5 years ago, he recognized that we were brother and sister. And I felt so honored by that, because I honestly respect him as much as anyone in the whole world. And I can't say that I have learned enough, not even remotely enough, to be an apprentice. He doesn't have an apprentice. One hasn't come along, and the world has changed too much. But I feel honored to be sitting side by side with him, praying on tobacco, and have him call me his sister. So that's been actually, I feel way better about that than I do some degree or something like that. And then this is a huge topic, and I'm not going to go there because it's so big, but Salvia divinorum, another plant from that region that these people know about, and that is one of his allies that he has trained with, and he has taught me a lot about her and the whole way of seeing the world through the presence of La Pastora, leaves of the shepherdess. That's the bloom. It's a member of the sage family. It's not an alkaloid. It's a whole different way of operating in the human central nervous system than all these other psychedelics that we take. And there's great mystery and lots of really unfortunate practices since La Pastora came along to us also without operating instructions. Or we never wait for operating instructions. That's kind of our culture's way, just gobble it up and think we know what we're doing. And so I think there's much to be learned there, but it's a really tricky one. And the Mazatecs, too, they say that, and I mean, not only Don Rutilio, I've heard this elsewhere, but that if you train for years with a mushroom, you know how to put someone into that state, even if they've never gone there before, work with them, help them find their balance, help them find what they need to come out and do the work of healing. You're helping them heal themselves. And you can trust that the next day they will be feet on the ground, head clear, able to walk home a little better than they came in. That's always the goal. Go out a little better than you came in, right? And with salvia, it's just very tricky. Sometimes it's absolutely miraculous for someone, and sometimes someone doesn't come back with their feet on the ground. There's a certain percentage that don't. And they're very careful about, the people I know, about interviewing someone before they will give them salvia to try to understand what their personality is, what their traumas are, why they're really there, and if they can go through this experience and come out better. And if they don't feel they can, they just won't do it with you. But salvia is available all year long because it's a plant. It doesn't freeze there. It's a very delicate plant, but still, it does grow year-round. And the mushrooms are not available all year round. So it's the backup, but it's also challenging. And I want to say that I've talked about him, but it really is the pair. And I always try to make this point that in the curanderos, the healers that I've worked with in different places, I see a pair. I see that people rarely work alone. They don't not necessarily a man with a wife or a woman with a husband. It might be in either way, but it might be someone's sister or someone's daughter or someone's strong apprentice or best friend. But someone is watching the healer's back. Someone is preparing the medicine. Someone is saying the second level of protective incantations that keep things flowing and that keep things nourishing and safe. And so I really want to honor that duality and also kind of like implicitly critique our, modern tendency to make someone a celebrity and also to just look at the guy or to just look at the front person and, the singer in the band but nobody else in the band kind of thing, So just remember, it's just like looking at nature. It all works together. I mean, you can't have an oak tree without the 200 other species down to the microbe level that make the oak tree possible, and that's how it is in these realms too. And so this is nowadays, these people moved down to the road. They were way up in the hills up there behind, and they moved down to the road and built a house out of bricks in the, it was in about 2006 or so. The son moved to Mexico City and made a little money and came back and would buy bricks each time until they had enough bricks to build a house and then build a second building. I took my daughter with me there, and then the road came along, and it varies according with politics in Mexico where a road comes in. And people think they want a road, but then they often regret that they got a road. And I wrote an article many years ago called Roads Where There Have Long Been Trails. It was about my work with the Mazatecs because of all the changes that come in. And basically that's what happened. That's what's happened. I'll finish up or get close to finishing up with this, that's what's happened is with our cultures shining the light on this on this other, quiet, nurturing, protected, magical-based culture, we built a concrete road into it, and roads flow both ways. All the stuff came out to us. We thought we wanted it. Mushrooms, we want exoticism, we want psychedelics, we want, tools. We do, sincerely. We're not, I know I'm sounding critical, but, we're suffering. We want tools, and we want help. And even if we don't know it, even if we just think we just want a good time, we want help, And they were hungry, and they needed some things, and their kids wanted to get an education, and some of their kids wanted to move to town. And so what's happened is since the road went in, the town just down the canyon farther got a lot bigger, and the trucks, the Coca-Cola trucks, all came racing through, and a lot of the young people have left, and many of them, once they leave, they don't speak Mazatec anymore. Some of them still have it bilingually, like most of the rest of this clan. 2/3 of the members of this clan have moved out of the region looking for work. NAFTA brought in jobs for 5 minutes, and by that time everybody had left their land, left the mountains, moved to the valleys, moved to the big cities, gotten a job, jobs left, and then they're just already lost their land, lost their language, their kids are being born there, they've married somebody of a different ethnicity, different indigenous people of different ethnicities marrying each other, or not marrying each other, they don't really get married, but having babies together and kind of living together, blending all these different indigenous cultures together. I've observed a lot about that. And so in my, nearly quarter of century of watching this clan, part of what I'm documenting is how brilliant they are at surviving even under these dire conditions. All branches of these families are very poor people. You would not believe the way some of them live. Some of them who've moved out to the towns too. The kinds of places you see built out of tin and cardboard on the side of the railroad if you're in a third world country. Some of it's like that. And at the same time, they have strong spirits, and their belief systems are blending, and they don't have their mushrooms, and they don't speak the mother tongue. And when I go down to visit, I gather up, they're mostly women-led families. The men are kind of coming and going, or mostly going, and so women and their children, we gather up together, and I bring them up to the mountains, and we go have a reunion with the old great-grandparents up in the mountains, who he is now 89 years old, and so Is it not going there? So I'm asking this question, a couple of them. What comes next for them? What comes next for them if the lineage has been broken? And this question, does gnosis, knowledge, travel, does it evolve as it moves? If the mushrooms came here, maybe just cubensis came here, if we started to work with it, if we have a little enchantment about the Mazatec phenomenon that's kind of arisen in the last decade, with some people going back there to learn something about it, is that core relationship of human and psilocybin mushroom that has a certain kind of knowledge, a certain sort of like, what would you call it, a kind of like a style, a persona, a aesthetic of exhibiting itself, is that intact enough to be passed along? These are knowledge holders. They call these people chonta chinje. That's Mazatec for people of knowledge. And if you're a person of knowledge, then, well, they just know that every village, every mountainside has to have a person of knowledge who holds the knowledge. And so if this tradition of people of knowledge in this particular clan is ending, and the people, the descendants, they love the mountains and they love to go back, but it's just not the same as carrying on a tradition. And if they've been generous to me and I've documented this and done a lot of photography and a lot of writing about it and teaching more than anything, and then if other people have done some of that, are we actually carrying that essence, that spore of knowledge out into the world? Can we do that? And if so, you know, what is our responsibility for receiving this gift? All of these indigenous practices around the world are based on reciprocity, on concepts of reciprocity. We receive gifts, we give gifts back. So how do we hold this incredible gift of psilocybin in our hands and keep it alive and share it and work with it and help the planet and help each other and not... and yet not have that training and that long, long knowledge and those songs that they'll never be passed on. I mean, as I actually suffered for years at the loss of it, just heartbreak every time I would go at what was disappearing. And every time someone died, every time someone moved away, it was really heartbreak. And it was Bia herself who helped me accept. She's a good anthropologist. She observes and she accepts change, and change is interesting. And it helped me to actually look at this more and say, what kind of change is happening here? If this is a living world, an animistic world, which is the way I like to practice my worldview, then some gift is being given. There's some intentionality in this. We have it. We have it now. It's up to us, whatever it is. We don't know what it is, but we at least should know it is a really incredible, special gift that people very carefully tended for a very, very long time. And so if it's in our hands now, maybe it's just a transitory moment. Maybe this is just the handover moment for a century, and then a new way of really working with that and really carrying a new knowledge tradition into the future will happen, a knowledge tradition that will actually really help us, be one of the things that helps us. I don't know. So I'm putting those out there as speculative questions for you. And just a reminder here that this is his brother, who has since died. And just to think about carriers of ancient knowledge and what does that mean, and what is the relationship of mushrooms to ancient knowledge. And so this is a little map I made a long time ago now, but how it went from the Mazatec pointing down there to Mexico, not a drug, all of these other things, the role of the ritual expert, the spiritual presence, all of these ways that it works, ending in gratitude. And then it moved up here to the West Coast, and we saw it as a drug, but a natural drug. And then we noticed it was animated. Even Albert Hoffman, I once had a conversation with him in the back of a car. I was lucky to be placed in the back of a car with Albert Hoffman, the discoverer of LSD. And I said, what do you think about psilocybin mushrooms? Because he'd also, identified psilocybin and worked with that too. And he's like, I don't know, I'm just not really comfortable with psilocybin. There's somebody in there. So we have still some of that animism that we recognize, we who love mushrooms recognize that. And the unpredictability of it, and sometimes the sacredness of it, and I think always the gratitude in it. I mean, don't you all, if you have had that experience, feel like grateful for the beauty and riches of the world, no matter what else is going on? Grateful for insight, grateful for healing. And now it's been moved over to the sciences and to the universities of the Western world. And it's seen, and it's isolated. The psilocybin itself is isolated from the mushroom, and it's seen as a drug, but a very helpful drug. And there's some great studies going on, and it's a fascinating trend. It's not the only trend, and I will urge you all to remember the value of folk research, which you're probably all part of, and that is that we're each doing research and we're sharing the results. That's what I'm doing tonight, and we're respecting ourselves as researchers in the ways the world works, in the ways that these powerful substances work, in what does health and healing and balance mean, and how do these become parts of our values, parts of our life, and what do we hand on to others. So I'll say thank you to the mushrooms, and thank you to all my teachers, and thank you to all of you for being here and listening to me. I'm sorry somebody should have given me a clock, but I hope it was okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. So there's a microphone there? Yeah, there's a portable microphone there. If anyone would like to ask a question, please come up to the microphone and we'll have a little bit of discussion. There's a bathroom here and another one in the back, I think.
Check, check.
Thank you. Hello. I want to say thank you for bringing back all this knowledge to us. And my question specifically, you talked about we here in this culture don't really know how to use these tools. Could you share with us some detailed knowledge about how to better use these tools in a traditional manner?
Can I share with you some ways?
Instructions?
I have described a little bit, I would say, the focused attention, the intention, the setting up of a safe space with the concept that you would be open up to what's above, open up to receiving and sharing, to the kind of communication that I was talking about with the tobacco, at the same time as creating a kind of a boundary around you, so a vessel in which to do the work, whether it's you alone or you with others. I use that term, the work, a lot because I think that way. I think the work is to save the world. I mean, we each have to do it. We each have to do it in our own way, and there are myriad ways to do that, and we may each be doing it in a few ways too, but clearly it's just not a free ride. We really, really have to be paying attention to that. So I go in to work with it on my own I sometimes have a specific question or task to do, but if not, then I go into it first for a weather report. That's how I think of it. Okay, what can I feel? What can I see? What are the patterns that appear to me that don't appear in daily life? I think it's really, really good for seeing patterns. And if you understand patterns, if you get a glimpse of a pattern, remember it, because then it will be useful to you in your daily life, and in understanding how other things are connected, how one action here might affect several things over there. That's a pattern. And then also, yes, of course, we want to be reminded of the incredible beauty of the universe. And so that's something that we hope to witness and receive. And we don't always get that, but we do remarkably often. And joy, remember joy, and remember to let go of the things that you can't fix. You know, that kind of basics, that kind of stuff. But also I always find that the part of every ceremony is mending, is looking at what is torn around me that I might actually do something about. Sometimes it's a very small thing, and sometimes it's just saying words that you think, you know, positive things that you don't say. Sometimes it's understanding with compassion someone who bugs the hell out of you. You know, it's just like all kinds of mending. And I do feel from Don Rutilio, too, that mending is a really important part of what the role of the traditional role is. So those are a few things.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Hi.
Thank you for what you've done, and thank you for what you're doing, and thank you for what you're about to do. You're so lovely. I understand that you may need help in Hawaii because the pigs have come into the garden there. And
Yes.
I'm wondering if there are volunteer work opportunities on the Big Island.
Oh, okay. Well, this generous woman is mentioning that Botanical Dimensions and I own forested land in Hawaii that has been invaded, like much of Hawaii has been, by wild boars that are a blend of two different. Anyway, they're unlike boars anywhere else, even the ones here. They're actually really a lot like our president. I mean, I realize, I'm not kidding. I was out there in January and February, and I just like, they're so bad. There's so many of them. They're so loud. They're so stinky. They're so bristly. They're so, you know, like, they have such bad taste. I'm sorry. And he had just was being inaugurated, and I was like, oh my God, it's his totem. These like, they eat each other. They're just like, anyway, I don't mean to put down the species, but I've got a thing about the wild boars in Hawaii, and they are destroying the native forest, and they make it impossible to garden. They make it pretty impossible to step out of your house from dusk to dawn. So, yeah, I haven't mounted a public program for that yet, but I think I'm going to fundraise and ask for volunteers, but it's going to take a lot to fence and restore this land that has some rare ethnobotanical species in it. So if you're interested in helping in the future, maybe in the next 2 years, you could email me. There it is, info at Botanical Dimensions. We'll put you on the list. Okay, thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I was just wondering your opinion on the ongoing trend of microdosing of LSD or psilocybin. People are reporting it, making them feel sharper, et cetera, et cetera. Just wondering if you could confirm or deny any of these things.
Could you just say the last sentence again? I can't quite hear you. You wonder if I could...
yeah, I was just wondering
just
if you could
comment on the microdosing
Yeah,
phenomenon?
yeah.
Okay.
Your opinion.
Thank you. I haven't microdosed since the early 1980s when some of us did some experiments, and I found it interesting. I wasn't doing it, I think, as micro as people are doing it now, and I am curious. I don't know probably more than you do. I read and I listen to people, and I see that. I'm just curious at what this dose that's so small that you can't feel it does to you, but maybe it does something. And there are probably people in this room who've tried microdosing with psilocybin and who know a lot more than I do about it. I am personally more into transformative experiences, but hey, I'm exploring the totally weird and unknown realms of aging, and I may find that microdosing is the best thing next year, so you can ask me then.
Thank you very much.
Hi. First off, I wanted to say it's really fascinating to me that P. cubensis is the craftsman or work mushroom.
You know what? I think you can pick up that microphone, and maybe I can hear you better if you talk.
Okay. It's really fascinating to me that P. cubensis, you were saying, is the work mushroom or psilocybin. Yeah. That's oddly familiar, although this is definitely the first time I've heard that. My question for you is more the entheogenic culture, mind-altering or use mind-altering substances for spiritual purposes has been something that I've been fascinated by. In our American culture as a larger gestalt, there is a precedence for whenever you have a dangerous tool, there are organizations you can join that'll teach you best practices and harm reduction. And you want to fly a plane, join the EAA. You want to race a car, join the SCCA. You want to shoot a gun, join the NRA. What I wonder is why there isn't, or where the movement is for a similar notion of responsibility around entheogenic substance use, around minding your set and setting, making sure that you have a checklist that you can go through to make sure that people get as much of a positive experience from it. You know, right now this is knowledge that's passed down kind of between party throwers, but have you heard of, or would you is there any authoritative guide to safe use of substances, and or where could I look for more information?
Okay. Thank you for your question. We are on a threshold. It's a long threshold. So it's been 60 years since this was just brought out to the world from Mexico, and 40 since we figured out how to grow it, 30, something like that. And so that's just the beginning. And yes, there are trends. There are people who are studying the best practices for doing this kind of work, more, I think, as healers and as facilitators and as guides, not so much as just participants. But also, there's a wave of literature coming out every month, it seems. A new book is coming out about cannabis and about all the various psychedelics, and some of them are great. Some of them cover just a little part of the picture. Some of them, would you really want to follow this person into a ceremony? So, I mean, you have to be discerning about, what's published, of course, and of course what's on the internet is the whole range too. But I do think that we have matured enough in our relationship to these things that there's no reason to stop having a marvelous mushroom experience at a great festival for your favorite band. I mean, this isn't like a purist argument. It is, though, know your own boundaries, know your own capacity, know the medicine, know who you're with. Have some techniques for taking care of yourself or the people around you, And I think that this is coming along. I think that you'll encounter it more if you keep looking. Yeah. Okay, 2 more questions. That's it.
Hi. So you've gotten the opportunity to do some pretty incredible things, and you've gotten to meet some really interesting people and learn a lot. And I was just wondering what kind of advice you would give to someone who doesn't, necessarily know where they're going, but wants to explore and kind of be able to develop the connections that you were able to develop. Because of the fans, I'm having a hard time hearing everything. So that how someone would have these kind of experiences, or with more how you would have these kind of experiences, and what advice you would give as to developing these kind of connections that you have.
Connections with people? You mean field experiences? Like traveling and meeting people of another culture and working with them ceremonially. And not having it be a kind of you're paying for your 10-day tour thing. Well, learn a language, the language of the people you're going to. Be really, really respectful. Don't lead with questions. It's a relationship. Just find a way to be, if they let you even near, then find a way to be helpful and quiet and pay attention. You will learn a lot more by listening than you will by talking. My field work, I sometimes put under the umbrella term cleaning beans, because they grow their own beans. You go clean the pebbles out of the beans. All the beans they eat every single day of the year, they have harvested and need to be hand cleaned. And we sit and clean beans, women and men, for many hours, and stuff just happens, and stuff comes up, and some of it's in Spanish, and some of it's in Mazatec, and a stranger drops by, and an anecdote is told, and this and that, and it's just like, be present, be helpful, and see what you can learn, you know. And if they know you're particularly interested in plants, or you're particularly interested in songs or something like that, then they might guide it that way. But I have never known, of the various indigenous people I've known, I've never known anyone who's just direct. Oh, you came for this? Here. Or they're not even direct when they don't like you. Everything's indirect, you know. So it's a way of being, just being present with your 360-degree attention, and knowing that you're going to misunderstand and or miss almost everything. And the threads that you get are gifts, and they will grow, you know. But it's beginning a relationship is very, very tricky. If you have a friend who knows someone who's a friend of a friend, or you meet someone, I don't know, there's just things open up. You put yourself in a place where you want to learn something, and you be quiet and wait, and you go with time, then something will open up, and if you are paying attention, you'll know, oh, that window just opened, and just a crack, and now what can I offer? And maybe something will come back to me. It's a very abstract way of talking about it, and there's a lot more specific stuff, but it's really about, we're not trying to appropriate another culture. We're trying to just learn what needs to be known for the world to carry on. And some people who have this kind of knowledge are willing to share part of it, and they'll only share what they want to if they have the same kind of vision. Cultural appropriation is a very tricky topic, and it's a growing topic of discussion, which is a really good, important thing. But it just means then that cultural sensitivity is all the more important. And it's tricky to do that in a changing world. It's tricky to do it when your watch costs more than what they'll make in a year, maybe. And they can't, get batteries for your watch, so their watch isn't really what they need, It's like, how do you figure out how to value things, and how to value your experience, how to value what they offer, and how to deal with the fact that they're wondering what the heck you're doing there. Depends on how remote or how worldly they are. But I don't know that there is, in the mid-21st century, that there are those opportunities anymore. Being the first one to hang out with a particular ayahuasquero back in the 70s, and being, I don't know, it's changing so much. All of these powerful medicines are being discovered, so to speak, by outsiders and adopted, and it's changing where they come from. It's changing it everywhere, and so it's just how it is. So I don't know. I won't say more than that. It's too big a topic, but good luck.
Thank you.
Learn a language. Okay, I don't think we can do this too much longer. Okay.
Okay, last question. So this is kind of tangential to mushrooms and more about spiritual practice. You mentioned that going into those realms with psychedelics can open you up to certain attachments, and you mentioned spiritual entities and shielding rituals during taking psychedelics. And I have a question, if you think someone has developed an attachment, is there a path to go forward with that? Have you ever witnessed cleansing rituals for people?
Yeah.
Do you have an example?
Lots of cleansing rituals. Yes, if you don't already know what a limpia is, cleansing, that's a Spanish word for that, often done with leaves is kind of like smudging, and it's universal practices around the world for letting go, for helping someone be free of their history, be free of what's stuck to them, be free of something that's sucking their energy in some way, and be free of a negative thought pattern, that kind of thing. But also, there are daily practices, there are small practices. I'm actually teaching a class soon on sweeping the mountain of nerves. That's a Mazatec phrase. The mountain of nerves is the human body, mind, and sweeping the mountain of nerves is a phrase for cleansing that so that the mountain can stand solid. And but I will just teach what I've learned in a few different cultures. Really, I would say if it's a serious thing, if you can find someone that you can trust who knows how to do that, who's experienced, then take them to them. Ask for that help, for a limpia, for a cleansing, for a good, strong smudging, But also there are a growing body of trained certified therapists and uncertified therapists who are helping with integration and helping with people who've gotten in over their heads in ceremonies and gotten lost or gotten hurt or gotten attached to a dark vision or something like that. There are people, professionals that you can find now if you hunt, who are trained in both psychotherapy and in magical practices that might be helpful.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Mm-hmm. And they're mostly in Northern California, so
right on. Okay.
Here you are. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, yes, I'll let you make a comment. Yes.
Hi, you kind of spoke on this just briefly a second ago, but I wanted to know how we can use ceremony and ritual without, still bringing reverence to the plant medicines and entheogens without the cultural appropriation. How do we bring something unique to the table where we can practice and bring ceremony and make it unique to ourselves?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's been a question of mine for a long time too. What I've arrived at, and I've been lucky to be able to work with different peoples, but also to know something about my own ancestral practices, which are, Celtic and odd bits of other things, and I honestly feel I don't know ever if this, it's just so hard to know what is exactly the right thing to say in a world where everyone is so sensitive for good reason. But my sense is that that these behaviors are archetypal, that most of these practices are universal, not a specific song, not a specific deity or belief or description of something, but these ways. For instance, we were just talking about limpias. Everywhere people have swept and cleansed and bathed their out-of-balance people. Everywhere people have known how to set up a circle for sacred ceremony. Everywhere, everyone has known that there are certain things you don't do to expose people, to expose secrets, to expose the medicine itself. If you learn the universals and you draw on your own intuition, which is probably coming from your own ancestral knowledge that you didn't know you had, then you're not appropriating somebody's culture. You're just taking these patterns that have existed through tens of thousands of years of humans developing ritual, and you're putting them to work, weaving them in your own way. And that is really, it's a fine balance to find out what that is, but I firmly feel that it is possible and it is noble and it is absolutely okay to do that. You're just not mimicking anybody else, and you're not saying there's only one way to relate to that, right? Once these plants and these mushrooms have left their homeland and come out and they're in our hands, and we're woven from all of these different backgrounds, we're in a new game here on what is the way that you relate to that. But the archetypal ways that you relate, the form, the goals and values and the idea of keeping people safe and of bringing light in and helping people understand things and then sending them home in better shape, of opening them up and closing them back up again, so that they're functional, all of that kind of stuff. That's ancient universal technique. I hope that's helpful. Okay, Bia, yay.
I wanted to make a comment, and it's so lovely to hear Kat speak out of her beautiful gray hairs about microdosing and taking all kinds of psychedelics. I wanna grow old and have those hairs and say those things, and it's very graceful because there's such an ageism also, no? That I think this is a good example of how, it's part of our culture. We have older people that do these things among us. I just want to say something about this big question, cultural appropriation, and how can we do and what should we do and how can we be, everybody wants to be doing the right thing. I think the basic thing that Kat brings with this lecture is that we have a big trend about psychedelics, and every week, every other day, there's a new article out there. Psilocybin mushrooms cure addiction, psilocybin mushrooms and end-of-life anxiety and this and that. And we are so excited with this so-called psychedelic renaissance. But in all this expansion, what do we really know about mushrooms for traditional people? And this is the basic thing she's saying here. Let's look where this comes from. Let's try to have a little curiosity on the people that were traditionally using it. Let's try to learn about their lives. Let's try to learn about their beliefs. Let's try to hear them. Let's try to consider them existing agents in the world. And it's not like they existed and their mission was to pass this knowledge to us, and now, we are carrying this. They still exist, they still are practicing, and we hardly ever hear them. So I think that this is a very basic gap that exists in the psychedelic community in the U.S., is that we never hear any indigenous people. We don't care much about them. They exist to be the people who gave us a big gift that we are now so marveled and enchanted, and we kind of quote them legitimately, to say, this is traditional, this has been going since immemorial times. And I think this is just, the basic thing I would take of this lecture, if you want to do it right, it's just try to get a little bit informed. Try to learn, try to research. I think that is a basic respect. So that's a tip from anthropology. If you want to do these things, you have to go and see the world through that other people's eyes. You go to a region. You ask, what is the name of this mountain? Who is the people that lived here before I came? So I think that this is an ongoing movement, and Kat is a pioneer, but in a discreet way, because she's not advertising that. But she has been doing that for a long time. And now in psychedelic science, 2017, I was a curator of the plant medicine track, and we invited a Native American leader. It was a huge battle. Nobody that worked with the Native American leaders wanted. Nobody that from MAPS wanted. It was pushy. And all of a sudden, we had a Native American leader from NACNA, the former chairman from NACNA, talking in Oakland about peyote sustainability crisis, because peyote is a substance from the land that is in a huge conservation crisis. It's disappearing. It's protected species. The wild populations are going down. So in the midst of all this huge trend, do we connect to what has been here before us, to the psychedelics of this land? And yeah, I think that I think Kat's lecture about Mazatec is especially interesting in this, trend about psilocybin, and how we also use psilocybin in a kind of different way, extracted from the traditional context, putting in the substance a lot of value, and forgetting that it's about relationships, that healing involves context, and it's not just pharmacological properties. And this is what she's bringing here. She's bringing the context of healing. But sorry that I like to speak a lot, so that's it.
No,
Okay.
thank
Thanks.
you. You're, thank you. And before I let Ken close it here, I'll just say, if you want to learn more about this marvelous woman and her work, she did organize the entire plant medicine track for the giant psychedelic science conference that just happened, which is all online, 120 lectures online. But also, Bia has started chacruna.net, CHACRUNA net.net, and copy.net, also KAHPI.net. Those are both totally great information websites about various psychedelic species. And they're growing and changing, and she's got really high standards for who she lets put anything on there. So I recommend them. And thank you so much for your long attention.
I'd just like to say that Bay Area Applied Mycology is completely honored, as always should be, that we have Walking History with us today. And we are totally honored to have such a beautiful person giving such a beautiful presentation. So in American tradition, we are offering her a beautiful bouquet this evening. In order to do this, Enrique, who grew the bouquet himself, is here to give it to her. Enrique is one of our emeritus members of Bay Area Applied Mycology.
I just wanted to thank Kat for her time, her effort, and it's an honor to have her speak to us. And now here's the bouquet. When we went to her house to do a little garden for her, I did not see one there, so now she has one. This is for you.
Well, I'm hoping they'll come back and bring it with them, because it's going to be hard to take it to San Francisco right now. But I'm going on a road trip right now.
We will make sure it gets there.
Thank you so much. Okay, great. Thanks, everybody.
Sean, the president of BAM, has the raffle tickets this evening. So if you have paid for raffle tickets, you may. He's about to honor the tickets.
Yeah, alrighty, guys. Thank you again all for coming out. It's on. Hello. Yeah, that works. I'd like to thank you all for coming out. I'd like to thank KatHarrison for that incredible presentation. And for any of you folks that are holding lottery tickets, we do have some items up here to raffle off. So I'll start with number 1, the San Pedro cactuses here.